Hi there, this is Ryan Clancy here with another edition of No Labels Talks with my friend and colleague, Holly Page. Holly, how you doing?
I'm great, Ryan. Just buckled in for the roller coaster that we're all on.
I can't take the procession of just constant news so yesterday it was like at 2:30. I was at a pool with my daughter. She was trying to convince me to go down the big slide, which I had already done like 20 times. And to be honest, I mean, I wanted to do 20 more times. But I had to take half an hour away to react to the fact that Joe Biden dropped out of the race.
It was incredible. A bit of news that I know some of us had thought was coming, but none more so than our guest later that we'll get to, Mark Halperin, who really called this his President Biden's exit from the presidential race of 2024. It was pretty astounding how accurate, for the most part, Mark was.
He was. He reported that last Thursday night, and through the middle of the day, I was thinking to myself, well, I guess he was wrong. He turned out to be right. I got to say, this morning there's a lot of talk about the historical significance of what President Biden did. And look, credit where it's due. I do think he did the right thing for himself, for the party, for the country, and like, that should be acknowledged. I think it really, in so many ways, could have just been terrible for the country if this continued on like this. And the fact that that's not going to happen, that's a good thing. But I cannot get behind the lionization of the decision that we're seeing in some quarters, as if this is like the moment when George Washington walked away from the presidency at the end of his term. Because Holly, you and I both know, we know the backstory of how we got here to this moment, and it's a very ugly story that involves the most powerful forces in the Democratic Party completely destroying and seeking to shut down any voice that dissented, any form of competition, either in the primary or outside of it.
Totally agree with you, Ryan, as usual, I might add. And, I'm okay with not going deep and, in a investigative journalism right at this moment on everything that you just mentioned, but it has to be done. There has to be a reckoning. The irony of the Democratic Party operatives who came so hard at No Labels, who charged that we were going to have a selection process of a smoke-filled room. I mean, that's exactly what really is happening, because they've run out of time, because President Biden, people around him, and even to himself, was not being honest about his limitations. So it's going to be a fascinating movie, is all I can say.
It does drive me a little crazy when I see some of these same people, and they shall remain nameless, but they're still, I see them quoted in these stories, and believe me, it's not a professional jealousy. It's a matter of accountability.
I know.
These people who literally got every single thing wrong, who just intentionally snowed the public. Like, so many of them remind me of, for those of us who are old enough, at the beginning of the Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's press secretary was this guy named Baghdad Bob, who would come out in front of the cameras and say, oh, we're winning. The Americans aren't even here. As American tanks, you could see them over his right shoulder in the background. And it's like, it's that level of delusion these people were pushing on the public for months and months and months. And
I know I kept thinking, they're acting as if it's Soviet Russia in 1950. It was bizarre. And in fact, the voters were very clear. They were nervous about, it's not just President Biden's age, because I think age does play differently with individuals. It was the kind of cognitive disconnect that we were seeing snippets of, but that his, aides were doing a terrific job of really concealing.
yeah.
And, the public was onto it. And the fact that we were all being told, no, don't believe what you're seeing and don't believe what you're hearing. And, it was offensive. And I think, as we have discussed before, I think the Democratic Party's done itself a lot of long-term damage because of an erosion of trust.
They have, absolutely. And look, for the people listening who were with the No Labels Unity ticket, who supported it, who wanted it. I think you should feel confident that your getting behind this was consistent with what the public wanted and what the moment demanded. And maybe if we had been a little stronger, maybe if some of the actors working against us hadn't been so malicious in what they did, maybe we would have broke through. But I think it's really important for people to feel good that challenging a broken existing political order is something you should not apologize for. And in fact, is something we have to do a lot more of.
Absolutely, totally agree with you. I mean, it's unquestionable now, we diagnosed the problem correctly. And, that in and of itself is an amazing feat, but to back that up with then, thanks to the vision really of Nancy Jacobson, we came up with a solution. And it might not be the best solution, it might not have been perfect, but it was better than what anybody else had on the table.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think anybody who could see the vision of what needed to happen and put their name and reputation on the line to help advance this, I'm delighted for that reason that we've been validated. Sad for the nation, because
Of course.
it is a kind of really treacherous moment as we go forward.
Well, look, we got a really fascinating discussion this week with three thinkers and strategists who we actually got together a couple of weeks ago in the wake of the first debate. But of course, we know them really well because several of them helped us with strategy during the Unity ticket effort. So you're going to hear from Dritan Nesho, the pollster from Harris, Chris McNulty, who's really an expert on data modeling and understanding all the different sectors and subsectors of the electorate, and of course, Mark Halperin from the Wide World of News newsletter, who saw earlier than anybody else that President Biden was going to be stepping away. So enjoy this week's edition of No Labels Talks. Hi, everybody. This is Ryan Clancy here for another edition of No Labels Talks, on the heels of which what was obviously such a consequential week in our political life over the course of the last couple of days, coming off the horrific attempt on former President Trump's life. Now we have one of the major party nominees leaving the race. And given all the things that are changing, we wanted to bring back together this panel that we had a couple of weeks ago in the wake of President Biden's debate performance. We got Chris McNulty, modeling expert from Causeway Solutions, Dritan Nesho, CEO of the Harris poll, and Mark Halperin from the Wide World of News newsletter. Mark, in particular, is somebody who on Thursday night was the first to publicly report that President Biden would be leaving the campaign by Sunday and that he would actually be staying on as president, not resigning. Mark, of course, as late as Friday and into Saturday, if you talk to Biden campaign people, they were resolute. He wasn't going anywhere. And then suddenly Sunday, we got the news on X. So the question is, did something change over the weekend, or they were just doing a holding pattern and they were planning all along for Sunday to be the day for him to leave?
Well, by Thursday, Sunday was a tentative day. I think three things occurred between Thursday and Sunday to reinforce, because he was looking to try to run out the clock because of his general decision-making capacity, which is limited. One thing was they got back a little bit more private data that convinced him there was no route to 270 electoral votes. Two is Nancy Pelosi made it clear in terms that have yet to be revealed, but I think when they are, will shock people, that if he didn't act by Sunday, there were going to be severe public consequences starting today. And then third is, you'll recall, there was a lot of people came out against him on Friday, but it was pretty slow on Saturday. And the idea was to give him a little bit of a lull to make sure that he could feel like he was getting out on his own terms rather than being chased by a pack of wolves. And I think Pelosi was able, just as she was able to orchestrate the drumbeat on Friday of warning was able to tamp it down enough that he could feel comfortable getting out without feeling like he was being forced out, even though he was.
Yeah. Mark, initially you had your sources had told you that they did not think he was going to endorse Vice President Biden, Vice President Harris on the way out, but of course he did. Do you have any insight on how that changed over time?
Yeah, so he wasn't going to endorse her for the same reason that Barack Obama hasn't endorsed her, and some people didn't endorse her yesterday. She and as her statement suggested, they want to create the illusion that she's fighting for this, that it's not just the elites of the party getting together and foreclosing competition, because of course part of what got them into trouble in the first place was no competition, no genuine competition for President Biden in getting the nomination. So the idea was to not endorse. That was the plan, and that was a plan supported by some people in her orbit. When I reported that he wasn't going to, however, other people in her orbit and other people in President Biden's orbit were very unhappy and thought it would be extremely disrespectful and would look weird, and said, let other people like President Obama not endorse right away. And so, as I understand it, he changed his mind, and his advisors changed their mind, and her advisors changed their mind that he would go ahead and endorse. But I'm quite confident that that was not the original plan.
Before I turn to Dritan and Chris, I have one other question, which is, as of today, I mean, we're talking here about 2:00 or thereabouts on Monday afternoon, and the endorsements of Vice President Harris just keep piling up. So now you have Speaker Pelosi, Biden, the Clintons, all 50 Democratic state co-chairs, bunch of unions, half the Democrats in the House and counting. She, of course, does not officially have the nomination, but Mark, does she have the nomination? She's going to be the nominee?
I think the only way she wouldn't be the nominee is if some investigative reporter or opposition researcher came up with some scandal that was so immense that the party decided to have an truly open convention rather than what I call a contested convention without a contest. I think probably by Thursday she'll have enough delegates to be commitments from enough delegates to be nominated. The DNC hasn't worked out exactly how they're going to do this and whether they'll still do the virtual roll call. But I really, at this point, except for some big scandal, I don't think there's any stopping her. And at this point also, she's been endorsed by almost everyone who one could imagine running against her, except maybe Senator Sanders. And I don't think Senator Sanders could beat her at this point because of the makeup of the delegations.
Yeah. Chris, Dritan, I want to ask you about where the public stands now on Vice President Harris. We, of course, have a long campaign ahead of us. She'll have plenty of time and space to define herself. But Dritan, maybe we can start with you. Is one, I want to know what American voters think of Vice President Harris right now. But number two, I also want to know what space does she have to change those perceptions for better or worse? How well do they feel like they know her?
Absolutely. So polling up until now has had Harris, by and large, with similar numbers to President Biden. Similar approval ratings, very deeply underwater at around 38 to 40%. Similar polling numbers. In fact, Harris in a head-to-head matchup with Trump has always done a little bit worse than President Biden. So what I would expect coming out of this announcement and Harris moving into a nominee spot is the allaying of fears amongst the Democratic base. And in fact, we have polling from over the weekend that shows that Democrats seem to be much less concerned now, and you take the age question and the fitness question out of the table. But that's the easy part. And the other big news from our polling over the weekend is that it looks like post his convention speech, President Trump has more than doubled his lead on both Biden and Harris. And if you look at likely voters, that lead now is double digits. It hits 10 points exactly within our polling. And this is polling.
You mean nationally?
This is nationally, yes. So not on a state-by-state basis. So what I expect is, and we saw this to some extent with the fundraising turn overnight, Vice President Harris raised more than $48 million, is that Democrats will be energized. We'll have to see whether or not that lasts. Harris has always done a little bit better with undecided voters, especially with suburban women. But the fact that this group makes up or made up the composition of undecided voters in the horse race up until now tells us a lot, and tells us that Democrats, whether it was Biden or it is Harris as their nominee, are behind the 8 ball, and Trump seems to be pulling away further after his convention speech and a largely successful RNC convention. So that's
Chris,
the dynamic at play in the polling right now.
Chris, do you have a similar read on where we are now?
Yeah, per usual, Dritan does a great job presenting an awesome segue for me because we often agree. I look at this from the makeup of the electorate standpoint, and Harris, pre-Biden getting out, a couple of things had occurred, and we've talked about these things before. Going back, a couple things were true. Pre-assassination attempt, pre-Biden getting out. Number one, there was a stubborn amount of kind of, call them, I don't think it's the appropriate name, but you'll all understand it, Nikki Haley Republicans that were on the fence. They weren't locked in for Trump, let's put it that way. I think the assassination attempt brings a whole heck of a lot of those folks back to Trump world. It's a much smaller piece of the pie. The convention further consolidated that kind of Republican support for Trump. That had not been the case. It had always been out there as a vulnerability, pre-assassination attempt, pre-convention. They kind of come home, number one. So what you're left with after that, and we talked about this before, Biden support among likely voting Democrats has also always been okay. It's been decent. It is their get out the vote universe, moderate propensity, low propensity, hard Democrats that were not excited about Biden at all and not getting any better. The debate only served, as I think we talked about before, to further their fears and or lack of interest in supporting Joe Biden. That plus the assassination attempt, I think, necessitated the move here by Democrat leaders to go have an alternative. So what I think the Harris play is at the end of the day, the Democrats looked at it like this. Biden is incapable of prosecuting the case against Trump. He can't do it. He can't get out there. He can't do it. And his frailty exacerbates our problem for turnout among low propensity, mid propensity Democrats. We've got to make a change. I think at the end of this, what happens is, I think at the end, this is a turnout play by the Democrats. They saw not only losing the presidency, but quite possibly losing the Senate and the House as a real possibility. And while I don't know that Kamala wins the presidency, this ticket gives them a puncher's chance because of Trump's limitations at the presidency, but also allays their worst fears about the bottom collapsing on the House and the Senate because it's not motivating low propensity, mid propensity Democrats to show up. Well,
this leads nicely into the second question on everybody's mind, which is who will fill out the ticket. And of course, the answer to that will tell us a lot about the kind of campaign Vice President Harris wants to run. Mark, I'm curious what you're hearing on not only who's in contention, who do you think are the lead contenders for the vice presidency, but who's out? Who are some people that people thought might have been on the ticket and they're not going to be, based on what you're hearing?
Well, as I report on Thursday, there's already been vetting going on by an outside group affiliated with the vice president, because this is a process that's supposed to take months. And no one is fully vetted in the way that the press and the opposition research will vet them if they're on a national ticket. People who are in statewide office or who work for people in statewide office often think, well, I've run in North Carolina and it's really rough and tumble here, and so I've been vetted. No one has been, in my experience. And so there's some concern that some of the people close to the vice president, that some of these names that are out there are totally unvetted. They're unvetted politically, and they're unvetted in terms of like their personal finances. So I think some names that are being thrown around may just not pass the vet that's now being crashed. And I don't know who that is yet, but I've gotten the indication that there's at least one name that's frequently discussed. And I'm not comfortable saying on a call this size, but one of the people who's frequently discussed, based on what I've been told, there's just no way they'll be picked. I think Mark Kelly and Governor Shapiro are head and shoulders above the others in terms of who concerns the Trump campaign, number one, and who people around the vice president are attracted to. I don't know anything about what she thinks because I haven't been able to penetrate that yet. But I would look most closely at Governor Shapiro and Senator Kelly. And I think from the way the Trump people think of it, Senator Kelly is the best pick.
So that would be the person they'd least like to see. Harris.
Correct.
Kelly.
Correct.
Interesting. Dritan, Chris, any thoughts that you have on the VP search and what you think is likely to happen?
Well, I would say that we have polled all of the other oft-mentioned names within the Democratic Party, and one of the interesting things that we see, to the point that Mark made about this being a very Biden's announcement being more of him being pushed out in a very deliberate way by the party grants, is that most of the other candidates, whether is the governor of Pennsylvania or the governor of Michigan, Whitner, Andy Beshear, and so on and so forth, they don't have nearly the name ID that Harris or Biden have, which have almost universal name ID. But when you put them in a head-to-head with Trump, they only poll slightly worse than Biden and Harris do. And what I mean by that is that Trump, this is pre-convention speech, might have won by 10 points, but again, he was edging out Biden and Harris by 6 or 7 points himself. And so this goes to show a little bit the risk of anointing a successor rather than allowing an open process. And many of these other figures have actual traction within the electorate and significant room to grow. Now, if they are a vice presidential pick, are they able to help the president? History suggests that vice presidents can only hurt you. They don't really help you when they're part of a ticket. And, Harris has several liabilities that, voters would need to get over before they start then considering who the vice president is and what the strength of that ticket is. Simply put, people don't really vote for a vice president. And so I think that this is also the challenge that we have. No matter who she picks, it's unlikely to give her a big boost in the polling before she answers some difficult questions that she has as the newly appointed candidate.
Dritan, you mentioned her liabilities, and look, the liabilities of President Biden were well known, mostly around his age. The liabilities of former President Trump are well known, mostly around his rhetoric, his conduct after the 2020 election. What are, in the minds of voters, the things they're most concerned about with Vice President Harris?
Well, the way that I would phrase it in one sentence is that the reaction of voters, at least in our recent polling, is that Harris might be a little bit of too similar, too late. That she owns the Biden agenda as much as Biden does, and some issues like immigration, she owns them more because, at least superficially, she was supposed to be the immigration czar, the person single-handedly responsible for clamping down on illegal immigration on the southern border. And obviously, this is a big issue in this election, and she has deep liabilities on it, but also on inflation and so on and so forth. And I would say on the other side is that, there are some questions about her charisma, and there are some questions around whether or not she has enough time to build up the base that she needs to win. So again, a risky decision, maybe there'll be more competition than it seems, but as it stands, it seems like she's the anointed candidate, and she's she's a weak anointed candidate, I would say.
So Chris, this point about the coalition that Vice President Harris will have to build, and of course the vice presidential pick will tell us a lot about that. The conventional wisdom obviously seems to be she is going to pick a relatively moderate person from a key state, a governor, a Mark Kelly. But when you look at the actual models with the voters in it and what she needs to win, could she win with a base turnout strategy? Could she just double down on things that are going to make progressive voters happy? Or does she need meaningful outreach, both in terms of her message and her VP pick to the center?
We're a 47 country. So she can do a lot with base. It's always going to be close if the Democrat base is organized and the Republican base is organized, it's always going to be close. I think Dritan brings up a point, you bring up a point here. I think the choice of VP, I think the needle they're going to try to thread, this is without any inside knowledge, is the choice of VP has got to cover, we're in this period right now of Democrats are all coalescing for the most part saying Kamala is great and we're all for her and energy. But at the end of that, they're going to find they don't have Scranton Joe anymore. And they have what I think can be fair, a much more liberal top of the ticket than they did a week ago or a few days ago. And that is something that is not going to play well with swing voters, that if you just play it like that. So I think selection of VP here has got to get, as you, I think, indicated, Ryan, a moderate Democrat to kind of calm those fears. I think the base will be fine because I think the base, I'm speaking to the Democrat base here, the Democrat base's fear or concern was about Biden's age and Trump. They don't also, I don't believe they don't also need a high, steady diet of a bunch of liberal legislation promised as well. It's fear of Trump and Biden's age that kept them lack of excited, or, is what was their issues. I don't know. I think you've got to portray yourself more middle with your VP pick to cover up that left-leaning history that she has. And hopefully the age factor being relieved and fear of Trump carries the base where they want it to be.
Mark, what about the Republicans' reaction to this? There was, before President Biden announced he was getting out, Speaker Mike Johnson said something to the effect of, even if he wants to get off the ballot, it's not clear he could. He seemed to be signaling the Republicans were going to make it difficult to get Biden off the ballot. Is that an empty threat, or are there any states where if Republicans wanted to make mischief and make it hard to replace Biden, where they could?
I don't think there is. Republicans have hired a very good lawyer to try to do this, and the upper levels of the Trump campaign and the speaker are consumed with these process issues of the notion that there was a coup, undemocratic coup, the notion that they can't get on the ballot. I think their process arguments that I think by Republican sources who don't work for the campaign think these are all process stories that the voters wouldn't care about and that they're wasting time talking about them because they're not going to happen or have an effect, and voters don't care. They should be talking about inflation and immigration. I don't believe that they can keep them off the ballot. I think if they got some adverse ruling from a Republican election administrator, they'd go to court, and no judge is going to keep the Democratic nominee off a ballot that hasn't been printed yet. So I think my sources are right. It's a waste of time, and again, it's a distraction. It's not clear to anyone I'm talking to except the campaign why they think these are good issues to spend time talking about.
Overnight,
it's also potentially offensive. I think it's also potentially offensive and backfires on swing voters that see this as piling on and like it's stupid. It is. Mark's right. It's stupid.
Yeah.
It's stupid, but it's not stupid enough for the Speaker of the House to message on.
Yeah.
And particularly, I think the coup one is particularly stupid because he stepped down voluntarily. That's the way the Democratic Party can choose whoever they want. What do they want? Biden to be the nominee, even though he says he doesn't want to be? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Overnight, former President Trump was on Truth Social and in rare form, he was fulminating about this, and he was complaining about how he had to spend money against President Biden, who is now not the nominee. And he was suggesting, though there is a debate scheduled for September, that he might not participate in it unless the rules are changed in his favor. He didn't specify what those might be, though he suggested maybe it should be hosted by Fox. Mark, do you think there's anything to that? Would Trump ever not debate Vice President Harris?
Yeah. And I don't know if she'd debate him, although she could also call for, as he was calling before, for multiple debates. I think it's very up in the air. The other thing that puts it up in the air is they really don't want to do the debate with ABC. They now want to do the debate with Fox. So you're going to have, the reason the Commission on Presidential Debates was good was because it minimized the debate about debates. Now if the Trump people are going to dig in and say we're not doing ABC on the date agreed to, I'm not sure they'll ever get agreement on one debate, let alone multiple debates. And we don't know at this point if one side challenged the other side to multiple debates, we don't know what would happen. So I don't know. My gut is, my bottom line is, my gut is there'll be another debate between them because Trump won't be able to resist and she'll need it. But I'm not sure. I wouldn't count on there being a debate. But I think the base case is there's a debate.
I have one question for all of you, and then we are going to open it up to some questions from the people listening in. But do you think in the end there is any third-party candidate, I'm thinking in particular here of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is going to have any meaningful impact on the race? Mark, maybe I'll start with you.
I don't think the other candidates will. Kennedy's run a horrible race, and he's still not on the ballot in very many places. There's tons of states pending where they say they've handed in multiples of the required signatures to be on the ballot. Until he gets on in one of those, I'm skeptical because I know how hard it is to get the signatures. And then, assuming he's not on the ballot everywhere, and I don't think he'll be on everywhere, the question of how is he run? Where does he spend his time? What's his message? I think at this point, he's more likely to endorse Trump than to be on the ballot. But I don't know that his endorsement of Trump really moves that much votes. A lot of his support is Black voters right now. And I don't know if he endorsed Trump, whether those Black voters would move to Trump or not. So it's impossible to say is my general sense of that. But I don't think the Libertarian or Green candidates will be a big factor at this point.
Dritan, Chris, what do you think?
Go ahead, Chris.
Minimal impact. The most certain thing said here today was by Mark saying that Kennedy's run a horrible race, and he has. It's been really, really, really bad, and he hasn't garnered any support. He's squandered a big opportunity of voters, but it's because of where his belief system is. He can't go to where he needs to be in order to get voters. I think at the end of the day, his support / votes will be less than half of what polling is today for him, which puts him in the 3-4% range at best. So minimal impact, I think, on the bottom line.
I have one last question before we open it up, and I know it's early, though this morning the Now Harris campaign was out with their first ad. It was a contrast ad between her and former President Trump. Mark, have you gotten any signal about the way in which the message of this campaign will meaningfully change in terms of the things that the Harris campaign will be focused on that might be different from where the Biden campaign was focused?
So I think that tweet or that ad was actually not a new ad. I was made the same mistake. I think the ad you're talking about is actually an ad from her 20 campaign.
Interesting.
But it's great, and you could just rerun it if the lawyers say it's okay. The vice president, who I'm an admirer of and who I've known for a long time, I think has two challenges. She's a horrible manager, and she's horrible under pressure. And she's got to make a lot of decisions now about a lot of things, including about messaging. Most of the advice she's getting from people I know who are giving it to her directly or saying it to me is to come up with 2 or 3 centrist policies that break from the administration in a non-offensive way, and that voters could look to say she's got new ideas and she's more moderate than the administration in her record. And I've been given a bunch of things that, Ryan, would warm your heart because they're right up your alley. Someone today said to me, she should call for the firing of the head of the Secret Service, even if Biden hasn't inexplicably done it. So I don't know what she'll do, but I know she's being given advice like that.
Got it. Okay. Gonna open it up to some questions here. If you could all just say your name and where you're from. Let's start with Sean.
Thanks, Ryan and Mark. Thank you guys for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'm Sean, and I live in Texas now. Just moved from Colorado not too long ago. Just a couple things. One, when Ryan asked the question about the independent space, and even though in Wisconsin the election's been decided by less than 25,000 votes in that state for quite some time now, and 1% of the voters, even though Jill Stein is on that ballot, that might be considered not RFK Jr., so that might be something to look out for in the future. But my question is, when it comes to polling about African-American men, I think someone tapped on it earlier a little bit about, national polling, but the state-by-state polling is going to be really important. I'm curious to know, with Vice President Harris at the top of the ticket, what does the polling look like for African-American men? Are they still uneasy, particularly from her work in California as Attorney General? Some real concerns about that. Has anyone looked at polling for Black men?
Why don't we start with the pollster, Dritan?
Yeah, I mean, based on very little polling since the announcement, right? And obviously it's the trend of the polling that we have that looked at her as a potential matchup against Trump, but again, she wasn't the person on top of the ticket. Really, what you look at when you look at African-American men, Harris wins about 60% of them, and Trump wins about 40% of them in a head-to-head matchup. That would be significantly underperforming Biden's record with African-American men, and even Biden's current polling with African-American men. So that is a risk, right? I think Harris has some potential traction with independent voters, has potential traction with suburban women, which again are at play to the disadvantage of the Democratic Party. But one of her potential weak spots could be African-American men. And at least this polling from over the weekend suggests that she's underperforming Biden when it comes to African-American men.
Thanks, Dritan. Ian, you have a question.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm from Virginia. So my thinking is that this is sort of the perfect circumstance for anyone who would consider challenging Harris originally in 2028, like all the governors, Newsom, Bashir, Shapiro, Pritzker, because the consensus is that Harris is still going to lose in 2024 as the nominee, and that would clear her out of the running in 2028 and give the governors a clear shot at the Democratic nomination in 2028. This question's for any of you, really. Do you think this is what anyone who's being talked about as a potential challenger to Kamala Harris for the nomination is thinking? And is there anyone who could seriously challenge her for the nomination this August?
Mark, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Chris.
I don't think so. She's not beatable for the nomination. And many of them, some of them at least, would like to be on the ticket with her. Statistically, if you want to be president, the best thing to do is to be vice president. And so if you're ambitious, you'd be foolish not to take a shot on the ticket. But there's no way to beat her for the nomination, and you'd only hurt yourself with some of the party's key constituencies. So I think they're taking a pass, not because they don't think Trump is necessarily beatable, but because Harris is not beatable.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's no way to beat her, no way to get the nomination this cycle. So I think if you are endeavoring governor or Democrat, being on the ticket is the next best thing. You can, and the bona fides here are you get to say, I did a solid for the team when the team needed me. You get to go out and meet a national network of donors. And the likelihood is that if Harris is the nominee now and loses, she will not be the nominee 4 years from now. And you will have kind of practiced, if you will, and met a bunch of donors and people nationally to create the kind of organization you do to run a national campaign.
I agree. I agree with that perspective as well. I mean, look, President Biden is being lauded for stepping aside, but really stepping aside 6 months ago would have been significantly better for a more democratic process and to give ample runway to potential candidates to showcase themselves and make the case as to why they would be well positioned to beat Biden, beat Trump. The Democrats have a solid bench, but at this stage, it's very unlikely that any of them is able to mount a successful challenge to Vice President Harris. And if they did, they're cutting what is already a very short runway in half. And that's just not feasible.
Well, we'll be watching closely and certainly look to get this group back together again next time we have a significant event. And Lord knows we've had a lot of those lately. Mark Halperin, Chris McNulty, Dritan, Nesho, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here on No Labels Talks this week, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.